The fire had been burning in the east drawing room of Wyndermere Hall for 2 hours before the guests finished their first course, and by the time the fish was cleared, Tabitha Greymont had moved through her mother's favorite room 11 times without a single person noticing her face. That was, she had learned in 7 weeks of being Mrs. Webb the housekeeper, the first and most necessary skill of invisibility. Move quietly, keep your eyes level, and never, under any circumstances, let anyone see that you know the silver was bought in Edinburgh in 1849, because your grandmother wrote about it in 3 separate letters, all of which you have read. She knew where the silver was stored. She had polished it herself as a girl. The table was laid with it tonight. 42 pieces along the mahogany that the Greymont family had kept in this room for 4 generations, catching the light from the chandeliers that Tabitha's father had commissioned 2 years before he died. Lawrence Quinton sat at the head of it now, in the chair that had been her father's, laughing at something the man beside him had said. He had a broad, easy laugh, and the kind of face that looked well in rooms like this. Rooms that were not his, and that he had arranged to look as though they were. Tabitha had formed this opinion of him within 48 hours of her arrival, and had seen nothing since to revise it. She refilled a glass, moved to the next chair, refilled another, and did not look at Quinton's face. The guests she had catalogued carefully since their arrival 3 days ago, a retired judge and his wife from Ottawa, a member of Parliament and his rather bored daughter, 2 couples from Halifax whose connection to Quinton she had not yet determined, and an elderly widow named Mrs. Fenbourne, who had known the Greymont family for 40 years and who had, twice now, looked directly at Tabitha without the faintest flicker of recognition. That had been the hardest moment, both times. Tabitha had breathed through it in the way she breathed through most things these days, counting quietly to herself, moving her hands, letting the feeling pass without giving it anywhere to land on her face. And then there was the man at the far end of the table. He had arrived just before dinner was announced, and he had been introduced to Quinton with the brevity of someone who required no extended introduction. He was tall, dark-haired, somewhere north of 35, and he wore his evening clothes with the particular ease of a man accustomed to rooms far grander than this one. She had gathered his name from the murmur of guests. As he came through, the Duke of Harcastle, and she had filed it in the part of her mind she had been carefully building for 7 weeks, the part that held everything that did not quite add up about the running of this house. A duke had not been mentioned in Quinton's morning briefing to the household staff, which meant either the visit had been extended at the last moment, or Quinton had not wanted the staff to make too much of it. The Duke of Harcastle had not spoken much during dinner. He listened more than he talked, and the quality of his listening made Tabitha vaguely uneasy in a way she could not immediately name. It was organized attention, the kind that sorted information as it arrived rather than simply receiving it. Twice she had moved near him to refill his glass, and both times she had felt the precise discomfort of being in proximity to someone who was paying attention to the room rather than to their meal. She knew that feeling well. She had been doing the same thing herself for 7 weeks. Quinton was speaking now, and his voice had shifted to the register he used for announcements, warmer by a degree, carrying further, designed to arrive across a table as a gift. "I've been sitting on a piece of news all evening," he said, "and I find I can't hold it any longer." He paused. At his right, the woman in the green dress, a Daisy Marin, who had arrived 4 months ago in Quinton's company and had since settled into the house with the proprietary ease of someone who had already decided it would do, smiled in a way that suggested she had practiced the expression. "Miss Marin has agreed to be my wife," Quinton said, and so she will shortly be the mistress of Wyndermere Hall. The table responded the way tables respond to such announcements. Glasses lifted. Congratulations moved around the room in a warm murmur. Miss Marin received them with her chin at the angle of a woman who had decided some time ago that she deserved exactly this and had been waiting for the world to agree. And from her position at the sideboard, 3 steps behind the nearest chair, her hands at her sides, Tabitha Greymont heard the words Mistress of Wyndermere Hall and felt something move through her chest that was cold and exact and had nothing soft in it. She had known this was coming. She had understood from the moment Miss Marin arrived with 5 pieces of luggage and the manner of someone returning to a place they already considered their own. She had prepared herself for the announcement. She had stood at this sideboard and told herself quietly, as she told herself most things these days, that nothing she heard tonight would reach her face. She had been right that it would be said. She had been wrong about what it would feel like to hear it. Mistress of Wyndermere Hall, the hall where Tabitha had been born, the hall that had been Greymont land for 200 years, that her father had loved and managed and spent his last decade carefully restoring, the hall that had been taken from her by a will she had never seen him write, produced 11 days after his death by a solicitor she had never met, signed with a version of his name that was close enough to pass 2 expert assessments, but wrong in a way she could feel in her hands every time she held her father's real letters, which she had kept every one of. She stood at the sideboard and kept her face calm. Inside, something that had been held in place for 8 months quietly cracked, and she breathed through it and she let it close again. And by the time the room's congratulations had settled, she was still exactly where she had been, expression entirely neutral, hands at her sides. She was almost certain no one had seen. She was wrong. At the far end of the table, the Duke of Harcastle had lifted his glass with the others, because he was not a man who drew notice to himself by refusing the gestures of a room, but he had not been watching Quentin or Miss Marin. He had been watching the housekeeper at the sideboard. He watched her hear the words. He watched her face not change, and that was precisely the thing, because he had spent enough years in enough rooms to know the difference between a face that felt nothing and a face that was holding something very carefully in place. And this was the second kind. The restraint was nearly invisible, which was exactly why it was visible to someone looking for it. He had noticed her before the announcement, in the way he noticed things that did not fit their surroundings. She moved through this house as though she already knew where she was going, not the knowledge of a new employee who had learned the layout, but something older and more particular than that, the knowledge of a person for whom a space has meaning, rather than merely function. He had watched her hand slow just for a moment when she passed the portrait in the east corridor, a woman in a high-collared dress with the same gray eyes, the same quality of expression, and then continue as if the slowing had not happened. He had been thinking about it since the soup course. After the announcement, the thought rearranged itself into a question. What does Wyndermere Hall mean to her? Tabitha had come to Wyndermere Hall the way she came to most things since her father's death, by thinking it through alone, in a rented room in Halifax, for 6 weeks, until she arrived at the only plan that seemed possible. Her father, George Greymont, had died the previous February. He had been 56, in reasonable health, and the pneumonia had come quickly. He had also been in the middle of restructuring the estate's finances, which had taken damage in the decade prior, and which he had been methodically, patiently rebuilding. He had not, as far as Tabitha knew, changed his will, which had been drawn up when she was 14, and which left everything to her, absolutely, and without condition. The will that appeared after his death left everything to Lawrence Quinton, described as a close personal friend and trusted advisor of many years, which he was not. Her father had mentioned Quinton precisely once in her presence, in a tone she recognized as the one he used when he had formed an opinion he considered it unkind to share. Her solicitor, a decent, careful man, had told her that contesting the will would cost money she did not have and take time the estate did not have, and that the signature, whatever she believed about it, had been assessed as consistent with her father's hand by two independent experts. She had thanked him and paid what she owed and walked back to her rented room. She sat in that room for 6 weeks. She thought about her father. She thought about how he filed every letter he ever wrote, in folders sorted by year, in the oak cabinet behind his desk. She thought about the fact that he had spent 40 years not trusting anything important to memory alone. The evidence was in the house. It had to be. She had answered an advertisement for a housekeeper, given a false name, borrowed a wedding ring from her neighbor, and arrived with one trunk and references that could be arranged by someone with sufficient desperation and sufficient nerve. 7 weeks later, she had found almost nothing. The accounts she had access to were thin and troubled. Quinton needed money. She had pieced this together from numbers that did not reconcile, from conversations overheard through hallway doors, from the expression on his face when certain envelopes arrived. He was planning to sell something. Once he sold, whatever her father had left behind would go with it, and the window she was working within would close. She had perhaps 5 weeks left, perhaps fewer. She lay awake in the housekeeper's room at the end of the upper corridor. Her mother had used it as a sitting room. The latch on the window still stuck in cold weather, exactly as it always had, and stared at the ceiling and told herself, quietly and without much confidence, that she had not come this far to be stopped by an engagement announcement. In the morning, she would look again. She would look more carefully. The Duke of Harcastle found her in the library on the second morning of his visit. She had not heard him on the carpet, and so for a moment she did not know he was there. And he saw what she looked like when no one was watching. She was standing at the far shelf with a cloth in one hand and not using it, reading the spines instead, with an expression that had nothing of the housekeeper in it. There was grief in it, and familiarity, and the particular discipline of a person who knows they are not supposed to feel what they are feeling. He cleared his throat. She turned. The expression was gone before he could have named it. "Your Grace," she said, and dropped a brief, correct curtsy. "I beg your pardon. I wasn't informed you would want the library this morning." "I didn't tell anyone," he said. "I came to find you." A pause, the kind that meant she was deciding how to answer something she had not expected. "I'll see to the library later," she said, and moved toward the door. "That's not what I meant." He said it without moving. "I meant I came to find you, specifically." She stopped. "I have been watching you for 2 days," he said. "I have watched you move through this house without asking where anything is. I have watched you pause in front of the portrait in the east corridor. I watched you the evening before last put your hand on the dining room mantel in the dark when you thought the room was empty, the way a person touches something they know by memory." He paused. "I would like to know who you are." The color came to her face and left it. She had good control, he noted, better than most. "I am Mrs. Webb," she said, "the housekeeper. I was hired in March through an agency." No, he said, quietly. Not an argument, just a word set down in the space between them, the way you would place a truth someone already knew and was waiting to be asked to acknowledge. Her jaw tightened. She looked at a point past his shoulder. Then she said, with an evenness that cost her something, "I am not in a position to discuss whatever it is you believe you've observed. I have work to do, Please let me go." He let her go. He stood in the library alone for a while, thinking. Then he walked to the east corridor and stood in front of the portrait she had slowed at. The woman in it was perhaps 45, gray-eyed, dressed in the fashion of 60 years ago, with the expression of someone who had been asked to sit still and was tolerating it on very limited terms. A small brass plate below read, "Cecily Greymont, 1891. He looked at the portrait for a long time. Then he wrote 2 letters, one to his solicitor in Toronto, one to a colleague in Halifax whose name appeared in certain estate proceedings he had become aware of, and sent both before noon. Tabitha found it on the morning of the 5th day. She found it because she had been rising before anyone else since her 3rd week in the house, going through the study in the gray light that came through the east window before the household stirred. She had been through the drawers twice, through the filing cabinet 3 times, through the correspondence boxes 4 times, with increasing precision, looking for anything in her father's hand that spoke to his actual intentions in the months before he died. The letter was tucked inside the cover of the household accounts ledger for 1983, so old, so dry, so thoroughly uninteresting that apparently no one had thought it worth moving. It was a single sheet, in her father's handwriting, dated 7 weeks before his death. It was addressed to his personal solicitor in Halifax. It described, in the measured and precise language her father used for anything he wanted to be perfectly clear, a conversation with Lawrence Quinton in which Quinton had proposed that her father revise his will, naming Quinton as principal beneficiary in exchange for assistance with certain financial pressures of a pressing nature. Her father had declined. He had put the refusal in writing. He stated plainly that his intentions for the estate remained unchanged. Everything to his daughter Tabitha as set out in the existing will of 1989, and that any document suggesting otherwise should be considered fraudulent and traced accordingly. He had signed it. He had dated it. He had placed it inside the 1983 ledger because he was a careful man who had spent 40 years not trusting anything important to a single location, and who had wanted this particular document somewhere unremarkable enough that no one would think to look. She read it twice. Then she stood very still in her father's study, with the morning light coming through his window the way it always had, and she held the letter and felt the full weight of what it meant. She needed to get it out of the house. She needed a solicitor, not Quinton's man, not someone within Quinton's reach, but someone independent, someone who could assess it and act on it before Quinton had any reason to know it existed. She had perhaps a day, possibly less. She thought of the Duke of Harcastle. She thought of the way he had looked at her in the library, that quiet, flat certainty when he said no, as though the truth were simply there and needed only to be pointed at. She thought of the 2 letters she had watched him send the previous morning. She did not know where they had gone. She did not know if she could trust him. She knew almost nothing about him. But she knew that he was not Quinton's, not employed by him, not positioned to benefit from him, not looking at this house the way everyone else looked at it, as something belonging to Lawrence Quinton. She knew that he had stood in front of her grandmother's portrait and had said nothing afterward, but that his eyes had moved from the portrait to her face in a way that showed he had completed the thought. That was something. She put the letter inside her dress, against her skin, and went to find him. He was already in the corridor outside the study. The expression on his face, when he saw her, told her he had been looking. "I need to speak to you," she said. "Yes," he said, "I know." They stood in the corridor, and Tabitha Greymont told the Duke of Harcastle everything. She told it plainly, without performance, in the order it had happened, her father, the will that was not his, the solicitor she had never met, the advertisement she had answered, the 7 weeks of early mornings in a house that had been hers since birth. She told him about the portrait and what it was of. She took out the letter and gave it to him and watched him read it. He read it twice. Then he held it for a moment without speaking. "This is your house," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely parse, something that was not pity and not shock, and was somewhere in the vicinity of recognition. "You came in alone," he said. "No resources, no one who knew where you were. Looking for one piece of paper in a house full of people who could have had you removed on Quentin's word. There was no other way to get inside." "No," he said, and this time it was not a contradiction. It was something else, a quiet acknowledgement, the kind someone offers when they understand not just the fact but the weight of it. "No, I don't suppose there was." He gave the letter back to her. "I received a reply this morning from a solicitor in Halifax," he said. "An independent one. He has been looking into the irregularities in the Greymont estate proceedings for the past 4 months. He was engaged by your father's former accountant, who had concerns about the will's provenance that he could not substantiate without access to further documents." He met her eyes. "With this letter, he believes the case is strong. The paper and ink can be dated. The document predates Quentin's involvement with this property by over 20 years. And once a court establishes that the housekeeper is Tabitha Greymont, the question of fabrication becomes substantially harder to sustain." He paused. "I think," he said, "it is time to stop being Mrs. Webb." Quentin, she suspected, had sensed something shift. She did not know how, a servant who had seen too much, or simply the change in her own bearing that she could feel but could not always control. Whatever had triggered it, by noon he was telling guests in the tired and regretful tone of an employer managing a difficult situation that the housekeeper had been behaving unusually. Going through private rooms, making odd claims, appearing confused about the history of the house. She heard this from the kitchen maid by 12:30, and she understood its purpose immediately. He was writing the story first. He was writing it quickly, in front of witnesses, so that by the time she opened her mouth, the narrative would already exist. The unstable woman making claims, the patient employer doing his regretful best. He was building it the way her father had built things, carefully, in advance, with one eye on what would be needed later. She had perhaps 3 hours before it set. She found the Duke of Harcastle in the east sitting room and told him what was happening, and he listened with the still organized attention she had noticed at dinner and said, when she finished, "Then we move now." Quentin announced in the drawing room, to 5 guests assembled for afternoon tea, that Mrs. Webb would be leaving the household at the end of the week. He said it with the vocabulary of genuine regret and the eyes of a man establishing a record. He was still speaking when Tabitha came into the room. She had changed from the dark housekeeper's dress into the one good dress she had brought with her and told herself she would not need, plain, dark blue, well made in the way of clothes, worn by people who had once had money and had not entirely forgotten how. She walked to the center of the room, and she spoke without preamble and without apology, in the clear, steady voice she had found somewhere in the past 7 weeks that she had not known she possessed. "My name is Tabitha Greymont," she said. "I am the daughter of George Greymont, who built the library in this house and is buried in the churchyard at the east edge of this property. I have spent 7 weeks here as Mrs. Webb because it was the only way I could enter my own home. This morning I found, in the household accounts ledger for 1983, a letter my father wrote 7 weeks before his death." She held the letter up. "In this letter, my father explicitly declined Lawrence Quentin's proposal to alter his will, and stated in plain terms that any document suggesting otherwise should be treated as fraudulent. A solicitor in Halifax, who has been investigating the irregularities in the estate proceedings for the past 4 months, has confirmed that this letter, combined with the evidence already in his possession, constitutes a strong case. She looked around the room. I am not making this scene for pleasure. I am making it because Mr. Quentin spent the last 2 hours telling people I am unwell, and I prefer the truth to be on record before the story is finished. The room was very quiet. Quentin's face had moved through several things while she spoke and had settled into a cold, careful nothing. He turned to the Duke of Harcastle. "Your Grace," he said, and there was a careful warmth in it, the warmth of a man appealing to reason. "I think you can see that this situation calls for." "I can see," the Duke of Harcastle said, from his chair by the window, "that you chose to describe this woman as unwell before she had said a single word. That is not the response of someone with nothing to conceal." He stood. "I have already been in contact with the solicitor's office in Halifax. They are expecting us this afternoon." Quentin looked at him. He looked at Tabitha. He looked at the letter she was still holding. He sat down. The legal proceedings required 3 months, as such things do, and they were not easy. But the letter was genuine, the handwriting datable, and the solicitor's existing case was substantially strengthened. 2 people who had worked for Quentin gave statements, the handwriting experts, presented with evidence they had not previously had access to, revised their assessments. The solicitor, who had produced the fraudulent will, facing charges of his own, told the truth. Tabitha Greymont received Wyndermere Hall on a morning in late October, when the birches along the east lane had gone the color of old honey and the light came through the study window at the low, flat angle of autumn. She sat at her father's desk. She put her hands flat on the surface of it. She stayed like that for a while. Then she went through the house room by room, slowly, as she had done on her first day as Mrs. Webb, except that this time no one was watching and she did not have to keep anything out of her face. She let herself feel the full, strange weight of being somewhere that was hers, that had always been hers, and that she had fought her way back into alone. The Duke of Harcastle came to call 2 weeks later, on a sharp, clear afternoon, and they walked the grounds with the housekeeper, the real one now, re-engaged, a proper distance behind. They had talked more than either of them had planned during the proceedings. In solicitors' offices, in long drives between Halifax and the estate, in the careful correspondence of 2 people who were being precise about what they meant. He was a man who had spent a great deal of his life being useful to people who did not particularly see him as a person. She was a woman who had spent a great deal of hers being told, in small ways and large, that what she knew and felt and saw was probably mistaken. They had found, somewhere in the paperwork and the waiting, that they talked to each other differently. Without the performance of it, without the management of it. "I have something I want to say," he said, on the 3rd circuit of the walled garden, and his voice had shifted in the way she had come to recognize. "All right," she said. "I made a decision at some point in September that I was going to wait," he said. "I was not going to say anything while the estate was still in question. I did not want to be one more thing you were managing. And," he walked a few steps, "I did not want you to feel any obligation. A woman who has just fought for something that was already hers should not have to wonder, in any corner of her mind, whether she owes something to the man who helped her fight for it." "No," Tabitha said, "she shouldn't." "She doesn't," he said. "I want to be clear about that. You found the letter. You walked into that drawing room. Whatever happened after, it was what you did that decided it." He stopped walking and she stopped with him. The garden was cold and still and smelled of turned earth and the last of the season's growth. He looked at her without the careful neutral expression he maintained for the rest of the world. "What I want to say has nothing to do with the estate. It has to do with the fact that I have not, in a considerable number of years, met anyone I actually wanted to talk to, and I find I'm not willing to simply stop." Tabitha was quiet for a moment. She thought of the morning she had stood at the sideboard in her own dining room and heard a stranger's name given to everything her family had spent 200 years building. She thought of what it had felt like to be invisible in a house where every room held her history. She thought of the Duke standing in the library corridor, saying no in that quiet, certain way, as though the truth needed only someone to acknowledge it. "I spent 7 weeks in this house," she said, "and in all that time the only person who looked at me as though something was wrong, not what it was, just that something was you." She paused. "Do you know how long it had been since anyone looked at me that carefully?" "No," he said. "Long enough that I had stopped expecting it," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she saw in his face the thing she had noticed there before, the effort of a man who had trained himself to hold most things back, choosing not to. "I am asking you," he said, clearly and without any weight attached to it, "whether you would allow me to continue to know you. That is all." She took her time. "Then, yes," she said, "with my whole free will, which is entirely my own, yes." They were married in the spring, in the small stone church at the edge of the Wyndermere grounds, where 4 generations of Greymonts lay buried, and where the oldest graves had moss on them thick enough to read as permanent. She had wanted it there, and nowhere else, and she had wanted to walk the aisle alone. There was no one she wanted to give her away, and she had not come all this way to be given anywhere by anyone. She had come home on her own terms. She would be married on her own terms. She wore dark blue and her grandmother's pearl earrings, and nothing else of value. He was waiting at the front with the look of a man who had kept his face carefully arranged for 39 years, and had no interest in doing so today. When the minister asked who gave this woman to be married, there was a brief quiet in the church, and then Tabitha answered in her own voice, clear and unhurried, "I do." The Duke of Harcastle heard it and understood what it meant, and took her hand, and kept it. Wyndermere Hall opened that summer. The shut rooms were unsealed, the cold hearths lit. The house that had spent nearly 2 years in the hands of Lawrence Quinton, who was facing charges and was no longer anyone's concern, became again what it had been when Tabitha was a girl. A house with something happening in every room and light in every window. She kept her father's study as he had left it. The 1983 ledger sat on the shelf where she had found it, the letter still tucked inside its cover. She could have removed the letter. It was filed in triplicate with 3 separate solicitors and would never need to be retrieved again. But she left it where it was, inside the dullest ledger in the collection, in a room that had always known the shape of her. Her father had put it there because he trusted that someone would look. She had looked. That was the whole of it, and it was enough.